Is there a new war starting in Afghanistan? Well, 5 years ago, the Taliban swept across Afghanistan and captured Kabul with astonishing speed. The Afghan government collapsed, the United States withdrew, and after 20 years of war, the Taliban once again controlled almost the entire country. For a while, it looked like the war for Afghanistan was over, but now something is happening in northern Afghanistan. Taliban positions are being attacked. Senior Taliban officials are being killed. Armed resistance groups are becoming way more active. And in one remote district, anti-Taliban fighters recently did something extremely rare. They briefly took control of a district center. Quick favor, trying to get this channel to 5,000 subscribers as quick as possible. If you like what you hear, you know what to do. Now let's get back to it. None of this means the Taliban is about to lose control. Not even close. The Taliban still controls the government, the major cities, and essentially the entire country. But Afghanistan has a long history of small resistance movements becoming much bigger. And some of today's fighting is happening in the regions that resisted the Taliban before. So, 5 years after the Taliban declared victory, an old question is returning. Is this simply another insurgency the Taliban will crush? Or are we watching the beginning of another war for Afghanistan? So who's fighting the Taliban? Well, there isn't one opposition army. In fact, there are several. The best known is probably the NRF. It's led by a gentleman named Ahmad Massoud. His father was Ahmad Shah Massoud, the legendary Afghan commander. He fought the Soviet Union and later became one of the most important leaders of the Northern Alliance. He was assassinated just 2 days before September 11th. And today, his son is trying to continue that resistance. The NRF has maintained a guerrilla campaign, particularly in northern and northeastern Afghanistan. There's also the Afghan Freedom Front, made up in part of former members of Afghan security forces. And now, another player has entered, the Afghanistan United Front, led by former Afghan Lieutenant Sami Sadat. Sadat was a senior commander before the Afghan government collapsed in 2021. Now he's calling former soldiers back into the fight and has announced a military campaign against the Taliban. There are also smaller groups emerging. One recently managed to briefly seize the district center. That matters because actually taking territory from the Taliban has been extremely rare since 2021. And we've seen resistance in this geography before. The mountains of northeastern Afghanistan, these are some of the same regions where anti-Taliban resistance survived during the 1990s. Today's opposition is still small, fragmented, and nowhere near strong enough to challenge the Taliban nationally. But insurgencies really begin as a national army. They begin with fighters, difficult terrain, sympathetic communities, and somewhere to hide. The question is whether today's resistance can survive long enough to grow. Could they actually defeat the Taliban right now? Probably not. I mean, the Taliban controls Kabul, the major cities, border crossings, government institutions, and the security forces. The resistance doesn't control significant territory. It doesn't have an air force. It doesn't have the heavy weapons or logistics needed to fight conventionally across Afghanistan. And unlike the Northern Alliance in 2001, it doesn't have American air power behind it. But these groups don't have to defeat the Taliban today. First, they just have to survive. And Afghanistan is an extraordinarily difficult country in which to eliminate an insurgency. The mountains that frustrated the Soviet Union, the United States, and the old Afghan government, well, they haven't gone anywhere. For the resistance, the strategy can be much simpler. Attack a checkpoint, hit a military installation, kill an official, capture weapons, disappear back into the mountains. Then do it all over again. But one enormous piece is still missing: foreign support. Insurgencies become far more dangerous when they gain money, weapons, intelligence, training, or sanctuary from outside the country. The Northern Alliance eventually had exactly that. Today's resistance does not appear to have anything comparable, at least not yet. And that may be the most important thing to watch. Pakistan, Iran, Tajikistan, China, and Russia all have interests surrounding Afghanistan. If the resistance remains isolated and poorly supplied, the Taliban has an enormous advantage. But if an outside power decides weakening the Taliban is suddenly in its interest, well, hell, the equation changes. And one country in particular has had a dramatic falling out with the Taliban: Pakistan. Let's talk about what happened between Pakistan and the Taliban. For decades, Pakistan was widely viewed as the Taliban's most important outside supporter. Taliban leaders and fighters had deep connections across the border, and Pakistan was repeatedly accused of providing sanctuary during the war against the United States and the Afghan government. So when the Taliban returned to Kabul in 2021, many assumed Pakistan would be one of the biggest winners. Instead, the relationship has begun falling apart, and the biggest reason is another Taliban. The TTP and the Afghan Taliban are separate organizations, but they share ideological and historical connections. The TTP wants to overthrow the Pakistani government, and since the Taliban returned to power in Afghanistan, TTP attacks inside Pakistan have increased sharply. Pakistan says many of those fighters operate from sanctuaries inside Afghanistan. The Afghan Taliban denies that. But the dispute has escalated into airstrikes, border clashes, artillery fire, and direct fighting between Pakistani and Afghan Taliban forces. And that creates a major new problem for Kabul. The Taliban isn't only watching resistant groups inside Afghanistan anymore. It also has one of the region's most powerful militaries sitting across its border. Now, that doesn't mean Pakistan is secretly arming the National Resistance Front. We don't have any solid evidence of that. But if Pakistan eventually decides the Taliban government is a greater threat than the groups fighting it, Islamabad's calculation could change, and Pakistan wouldn't have to invade. Money matters, weapons matters, intelligence matters, safe territory matters. The Taliban's biggest advantage today is that its enemies remain divided, isolated, and poorly supplied. If that changes, Afghanistan becomes a very different story. So what would tell us there's a real war coming? Well, there's a few things to watch for. First, territory. Launching attacks is one thing. Holding districts for days or weeks would be something entirely different. Second, coordination. If these resistant groups begin sharing resources, coordinating attacks, or creating unified command, they become much more dangerous. Third, defections. If Taliban commanders, officials, or armed units begin switching sides, and an insurgency can grow quickly. Fourth, geography. If the fighting remains concentrated in remote northern regions, the Taliban may be able to contain it, but sustained attacks around Kabul, Kandahar, Herat, or other major cities would signal something much bigger. And finally, foreign support. That may be the most important factor of all. If weapons, money, intelligence, or security begin flowing to these groups from outside Afghanistan, today's small resistance movements could become something far more serious. None of that has happened on a scale that threatens the Taliban rule today. The Taliban remains overwhelmingly stronger. But Afghanistan has taught the world this lesson before. Wars there rarely begin with one dramatic moment. They grow slowly. One valley, one armed group, one outside supporter, until suddenly the conflict that looks small isn't small anymore. 5 years ago, the Taliban won because its enemies collapsed faster than almost anyone expected. Today, the question isn't whether the Taliban is about to collapse. It isn't. The question is whether its opponents can survive long enough, organize well enough, and find enough outside support to become something the Taliban can no longer ignore. And if that happens, Afghanistan's war may not have ended in 2021. It may have only paused. Hey, this is Frank with America's Geopolitics. If you like what you heard, don't forget to like and subscribe. See you next time.